And just like a late night TV infomercial, just wait, there's more. Now, you obviously know the markets crashed hard in March of 2020, right? When the entire global economy was shut down. And of course, the markets crashed when that happened, just like when the entire banking system crashed in 2008. And it was because the greedy homeowners. Yeah, right. Now, would you believe me if I told you the market crash of March 2020 actually started in September of 2019, long before the pandemic was even a word you had heard or used? Now, the banking system actually seized up, literally froze up overnight when interest rates in the overnight repo market soared to 10%, a level not seen since the 2008 global financial crisis. In fact, in the last quarter of 2019, before there was any news of, the COVID or the pandemic, the Fed had already pumped $4.5 trillion into the banking repo markets to unnamed trading houses on Wall Street. The Fed's emergency repo loan operations began on September 17, 2019, and from September 17, 2019 through the last acknowledged operation on July 2, 2020, the Fed's repo loans cumulatively totaled $11.23 trillion. And the Fed becomes even more interesting because Jerome Powell was very adamant at the time that the financial system was very healthy in late 2019, and the repo market hadn't had a flare-up in over 10 years since the great financial crash. But the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet in late 2019 was a leading indicator of what came next. And once again, it was the banks that caused the financial system to seize up and crash the markets. Now, in early 2022, the Federal Reserve quietly released the names of the banks that received these loans. And it was the same old names, the same old offenders, causing the same old problems. Of the largest borrowers were JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup, three of the Wall Street banks that were at the center of the subprime and derivatives crisis back in 2008 that brought down the U.S. economy. Now, these are some of the largest banks in America and around the world that desperately needed emergency liquidity in the repo markets. Okay, so what's next? Well, what the bankers have done in the best case is embezzled or really just straight up ripped us off. And of course, they don't want you, the public, to find out about this. And also because the debt levels are unsustainable and the markets can't be propped up any longer, what can you do? Well, when you've run out of moves on the game board, you have to reset the game. We've talked more about the unsustainability of the financial system and why I think we're close to an economic reset in this recent video that we'll put up here. And when we looked at where we stand in reference to the 80-year long-term debt cycle, and despite good old Janet Yellen claiming that we'd never see another financial crisis in our lifetimes, our governments have been quietly preparing for the next crisis and the associated embezzlement that would come with it. For example, let's look at an economic paper titled The Liquidation of Government Debt, written by the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, in 2011. In it, they accurately compared current debt levels around the world to the World War II era and also highlight how inflation and financial repression was successfully used to deleverage that huge government debt 80 years ago. Then we also have a 2019 BlackRock paper titled Dealing with the Next Downturn. And in it, BlackRock outlines how in the next crisis, policymakers would have to use helicopter money and enable the, quote, independent central banks to partner with governments to combine fiscal and monetary policy. Now, almost prophetically, this is exactly what happened around the world in early 2020 in response to the repo market crisis and the yield curve inversion of late 2019. Almost as if policymakers followed the BlackRock playbook. Now, all policymakers need is the right excuse to execute their plans to reset the system. So, is this why we always seem to be at war? Wars have been great for creating inflation and artificially high economic activity, and they're very useful to distract the masses from what's occurring behind the curtains. Now remember, high inflation and currency devaluation is generally how governments choose to default on debt when they're faced with a gigantic 130% debt to GDP threshold. Now, all governments need to execute this deleveraging is the right distraction and the right narrative to justify their debasement. It all goes back to the bread and circuses quote. With debt levels at World War II wartime levels, do the policymakers need the appearance of a war? Do they need the appearance of a war to enable them to embark on a wartime financing policy to shrink their debt? In the 1940s, during the massive government deleveraging, they justified the high inflation as a necessary to fight the Second World War. It was the American people's patriotic duty to buy war bonds that were losing 15% of purchasing power per year. Now, many believe the inflationary monetary policies exercised in the 1940s was all about fighting World War II, when in reality, it was a perfect opportunity for the government to deleverage and recapitalize their balance sheet. Now, it appears as though the same is happening today, as we continue to watch the never-ending wars being used as a scapegoat for other endeavors, which is becoming a more frequent occurrence in the 20th and even into the 21st century. Sadly, this banking scandal of 2008 wasn't a once-off mistake that our policymakers have made. Could it be possible that we're living through the reset as we speak? Now, in the short term, there's only one way to protect yourself from these out-of-control central bankers trying to loot the system and then reset the whole thing. That is, get rid of that fake fiat counterfeit currency. That is, get rid of the fake fiat counterfeit currency and buy real things, hard assets, things that cannot be artificially created. This is why the commodity markets are blowing up right now. Real things with real scarcity, like land, like oil, like energy, like gold, and like Bitcoin. Hard assets, that's what you want to buy at a time when we have fake fiat currency being printed at a never-ending pace. But what are you doing to protect yourself